You need to see. Whoa! That's almost as good as let there be light. And there was light. Thank you for your patience. Hello, New Day family online. Thank you so much for tuning in. Hey, welcome everybody. Welcome to part 65 of our deep dive study of the Gospel according to Mark. To briefly summarize where things are currently in the life and ministry of Jesus, Jesus is now acutely aware that his time on earth is running out. And so he and his 12 core disciples have recently left northern Israel, where Jesus conducted the majority of his public ministry, and he and the 12 headed to southern Israel, to the region. We're missing some pictures, slides here, young man. So the 12 headed, yes, to southern Israel, to the region of Judea, where the city of Jerusalem is. And for the past 3 days, Jesus and the 12 have been making day trips into Jerusalem and going up to the temple grounds, where he has been confronted by the Jewish religious authorities, who, by the way, have already determined to find a way to kill him. Jesus has now left the temple grounds, and while he was leaving, one of his disciples spoke glowingly about how magnificent the temple and the whole temple complex was. Upon which Jesus responded with a prophecy that the whole complex was going to be destroyed, that not one stone would be left upon another, implying that there would be a great war, that the Jews would be fighting against the Roman Empire and lose, with Rome leveling not only the temple complex, but the city of Jerusalem as a whole. Upon predicting this, Jesus and the 12 exited the temple grounds and the city and started making their way back to the town of Bethany, where they were staying. The route required that they go up and over the Mount of Olives. But when they reached the top, Jesus found a place to sit and to just look at Jerusalem. From that elevation where he was sitting, Jesus could actually see the temple. And he's likely reflecting on what could have been. But since the religious authorities have failed to recognize that Jesus is the Messiah that the Scripture foretold, and since they have outright rejected Jesus, God had no choice but to pronounce judgment upon them and upon Israel as a whole. Anyway, it's while Jesus is sitting and reflecting that Peter, James, John, and Andrew come over to ask him privately, when will these things happen? And what will the what? Sign be that they are all about to be fulfilled. Well, as we noted last time, the first question, when will these things happen, clearly have to do with what Jesus predicted about the destruction of the temple and by implication, the destruction of Jerusalem. But the second question that Peter, James, John, and Andrew ask seems to expand on the first question. They ask concerning futuristic events, what will be the sign that they are all about to be fulfilled? What does this addition of the word all encompass? Well, to the Jews, the destruction of the temple, the destruction of Jerusalem, the end of days, and the coming age would all have been intrinsically connected. And it's highly likely that the Jews of the first century would have assumed that these futuristic events would be happening back to back to back to back, i.e., there would be no real time lapse between them. If that was their assumption, and I think it was, then that's part of what makes the response that Jesus is about to give to the questions just asked a little difficult to parse out. Because it's obvious, right, that there has been a time lapse between the more immediate future prediction given about the destruction of the temple, which we know came to pass in AD 70, and what Jesus will be saying concerning the end of days, which clearly hasn't happened yet. So we need to keep that in mind over the next several weeks as we unpack Jesus' whole response, which is contained in the rest of Mark 13, and as we seek to parse out the events that have to do with and that lead up to the destruction of the temple and the events that pertain to the end of days and the second coming. So Jesus is actually dealing with two things here. Okay, with that, let's begin to unpack the first 4 verses of Jesus' response to the questions asked by the disciples, which are verses 5 through 8. And understand it is still day 3. This is Jesus' been his third visit to Jerusalem. He's left the city, he's on the top of the mountain. But it's still the third day. It's likely late in the afternoon. And in these verses, Mark tells us that Jesus says to them, "Watch out that no one deceives you. Many will come in my name, claiming, 'I am he,' and will deceive," what? "Many. When you hear of wars and rumors of wars, do not be," what? "Alarmed. Such things must happen, but the end is still to come. Nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom. There will be," what? "Earthquakes in various places, and famines. These are the beginning of birth pains." In verse 5, Jesus begins his response to the questions asked by Peter, James, John, and Andrew. And in this verse 5, we are told, Jesus said to them, "Watch out that no one deceives you." Jesus' opening warning here sets the stage for an extended prophecy that begins in verse 6. In this verse 6, Jesus tells the group before that, "Many will come in my name, claiming, 'I am he,' and will deceive many." Jesus starts this section of Mark 13 with a warning to his disciples that they let no one deceive them, and then prophesies that many people will be deceived. Please take note, as we look at a text like this very carefully, please take note that the original 12 disciples had been with Jesus for at least 3 years by this juncture, and that they will soon be apostles who will be guiding the early church. So, it is not likely that they themselves could be deceived themselves by those, Jesus says in verse 6, are going to show up claiming that they are the Messiah. So the warning in verse 5 is itself forward-looking and applicable to future followers of Jesus, and not just in the first century, but right up to the present. For example, some of you will remember the Reverend Sun Myung Moon, who founded the Unification Church in 1954, and who claimed to be the second coming of Christ. Reverend Moon performed mass weddings. He held huge rallies and claimed to have 3 million followers worldwide. Reverend Moon died in 2012 and was said to be worth $900 million. His Unification Church, in case you're wondering, continues to exist to this day. Other well-known figures of the 20th century that could be included among those whom Jesus warned about are Jim Jones, leader of the People's Temple. He claimed to be the Messiah. Marshall Applewhite, founder of the Heaven's Gate cult, he declared himself to be Jesus Christ. And Yahweh ben Yahweh, founder of the nation of Yahweh, he claimed to be the Messiah. So when Jesus predicted there'd be many who will come claiming to be the Messiah, don't think that this was just going to be happening back in the first century. For this has obviously happened in modern times as well. With that said, there were in fact first century individuals that claimed to be the Messiah. For example, there were messianic pretenders who claimed to be the Messiah with the ulterior motive of gathering a following to revolt against the hated Romans that had subjected them. This would have had a real appeal to some because, as you will recall from previous messages in this series, the Jews of the first century were anticipating that the promised Messiah would be a warring Messiah that would lead them into battle against the Rome and give them victory over the Romans. And that's why when Jesus first told his core disciples that he had come to be a suffering Messiah, Peter went off on him. Do you remember that? For a suffering Messiah was not at all what the Jews, including Jesus' disciples, anticipated or wanted. They wanted to kill Romans. And that's what first century Jews had come to believe the promised Messiah was going to lead them in doing once he came. The famous Jewish historian, Josephus, writes that in the years preceding the great Jewish revolt of AD 66, that there was a Jew by the name of Theudas who boasted various signs, including the ability to part the Jordan River, who led people astray for the purpose of gathering a following to revolt against Rome. Acts 5, verses 36 and 37 refers to this very same Theudas. And another that had gained a following for the purposes of revolt. In these verses, a highly respected teacher of Old Testament law by the name of Gamaliel is quoted as saying, this is in your Bibles, some time ago, Theudas appeared, claiming to be somebody, and about 400 men rallied to him. He was killed, and all his followers dispersed, and it all came to nothing. After him, Judas, a different Judas the Galilean appeared in the days of the census and led a band of people in revolt. He too was killed, and all his followers were scattered. Jesus prophesied that many messianic figures, pretenders, or claimants will show up who will mislead for various reasons, i.e., to achieve various and differing ends. A key word in this prophecy, at least to me, is the word many. What amount constitutes many? We are not told. But it clearly refers to a lot. in my view. And this suggests that the end of days was not imminent back then, and that a few messianic pretenders in our day does not necessarily indicate that the end of days is imminent now either. Now, I know this is different from what you hear out there, all the popular stuff, but we're looking at the text carefully, right? We're looking at it carefully. So here's the thing. For there to be many pretenders, messianic figures, for there to be many, there has to be a lot that accumulatively are or have been appearing over the centuries. This is all to say that the appearance of one who claims to be Christ or the Messiah is not a sign that the end of days is near. Right? This is Jesus' first warning to his followers then and now, in my opinion, his first warning against sign seeking. The admonition is to not let anyone claiming to be the true Messiah or Christ deceive or mislead us. In other words, Jesus' admonition here is to not think that a false Christ showing up on the scene is somehow a sign that indicates that the end of days are at hand. No. Jesus' admonition is for us to not be deceived or misled by such a one when they show up. Many will claim over the centuries to be the Messiah or Christ, and many will be deceived by them. Don't let yourself be among that number, Jesus is saying in verses 5 and 6 of today's text. Jesus then goes on in verses 7 and 8 of today's text to tell his disciples then and now, when you hear of wars and rumors of wars, what? Do not be alarmed. But it seems like today everybody does get alarmed. Jesus says, do not be alarmed. Such things must happen, but the end is what? Still to come. Nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom. There will be earthquakes, natural disasters in various places, and famines. These are the beginning of birth pains. Hearing of wars breaking out or hearing rumors of wars that are about to break out have been used to lead Jesus' followers into believing the end of days and the second coming of Jesus is imminent since the first century. People have been using wars and rumors of war. Oh, he's coming back. Oh, he's coming back, right? This has been going on since the first century, folks. What Jesus says in today's text was said a few years prior to 40 A.D. Jesus also ascended back into heaven a few years before 40 A.D. And I want us to understand that before noting the fact that in 41 A.D., there were fears of war breaking out when Caligula, the emperor of Rome, from 37 to 41 A.D., who believed himself to be a god, attempted to erect a statue of himself inside the Jewish temple in Jerusalem, which would have been an abomination to the Jews, and it's highly probable that a war would have broken out if Caligula had followed through with that. The famous Jewish historian Josephus also refers in his writings to the rumors of war that were circulating in Caligula's day. War didn't break out then, but as we learned last week, 25 years later in AD 66, total war did break out when a revolt by the Jewish group known as the Zealots plunged all of Israel into a catastrophic defeat by Rome. Jesus knew that that near future event was going to happen. He predicted it. Jesus also would have known that Christians were going to be led to believe that war was a certain sign of the imminent return of Jesus. But Jesus tells his followers of that era and in every era, when you hear of wars and rumors of wars, do not be alarmed. Such things must happen, but the end is still to come. Is this making sense to you? It's different from what you're hearing out there, right? Because they're not looking carefully at the text. You're looking carefully at the text today. I've been a follower of Jesus since age 20. I've been in full-time ministry for over 40 years. And during my 51-year walk with God, pretty much every time Israel is in a conflict, there have been those who are into prophecy passionately declare from their pulpits or on their radio programs or on television, it's a sign. Jesus' return is imminent. The end of days is at hand. And they do this even though Jesus made clear that it is not a sign that the end is at hand or that his return is imminent. To put it in his own words, Jesus says, do not be alarmed when you hear of wars and rumors of wars. Such things must happen, but the end is still to come. Think about this, folks. Do you know that there has never been a century that we humans are aware of that there hasn't been wars and rumors of wars? Not one century has gone by without people hearing of wars and rumors of wars. There have always been wars. There have always been rumors of wars. So, false Christs showing up on the scene is not a sign. And hearing of wars and rumors of wars is not a sign. And as we continue our study of Mark 13 this week and for the weeks to come, we're going to discover, I know you don't want to hear this, we're going to discover that sign seeking is not something Jesus really encourages, but discourages. Sorry to disappoint. Wars and rumors of wars must happen, Jesus says. And he continues in verse 8a by sort of doubling down when he says, nation will rise against nation and kingdom against kingdom. So, just expect that those things will be happening. It can be rightly argued that reasons why these things will always be a constant are because A, we humans are sinful, B, we live in a fallen world, C, there will always be evil tyrants seeking power or more power, D, there will always be subjected people seeking to be free, E, there will always be free people who want to remain free and so will fight those who seek to take away their freedom. Right? But in addition to these reasons as to why there will always be wars and rumors of wars and nations rising against nations, Jesus tells his disciples that such things must happen. Now that's a curious statement. Why do such things, at least some of them, have to happen? My educated guess is that it's because God uses such things to keep salvation history on course and to bring about the final outcome he intends. This does not necessarily mean that God causes wars or prompts one nation to rise against another, but rather that he uses such regularly occurring events to achieve his eternal purposes throughout human history till the foretold outcome gets accomplished. Right? Okay, in verse 3b or 8b, Jesus continues his current discourse by telling Peter, Andrew, James, and John that there will be earthquakes in various places and what? Famines. Over the 5+ decades that I've been a follower of Jesus, I can't tell you how many times I've heard teachers who are into prophecy point to what they say is an increasing number of earthquakes in the world and claim that this is one of the signs that Jesus' return is imminent. No! What Jesus is telling his followers in Mark 13:8 is that these natural disasters will occur, but that they are not indicators that the end is near or that his return is imminent. Earthquakes and famines are both being mentioned in the same context and paragraph where Jesus has just said, do not be alarmed. Such things must happen, but the end is still to come. In the time period leading up to the destruction of the great Jewish temple and of Jerusalem, there were multiple destructive earthquakes, e.g. earthquakes in AD 60 or 61 that destroyed the city of Laodicea, a city mentioned in the book of Revelation. That same earthquake also destroyed Colossae, which is the city that Paul wrote the book of Colossians to. That same earthquake also destroyed the prominent city of Hierapolis, which is mentioned in Colossians 4:13. In AD 62, the famous city of Pompeii experienced a very strong earthquake that caused extensive damage to that city, and the aftershocks of that earthquake lasted for days, which resulted in even more damage being done to that city. Much of the city of Corinth, to which Paul wrote the book of Corinthians, was destroyed by an earthquake in AD 77. In 76 or 77 AD, Cyprus, Greece, which is mentioned in Acts 4:36, and was the native home of Barnabas, Paul's missionary partner, was also hit by a destructive earthquake. Now, these ancient places were rebuilt, but the point is, the people who heard Jesus' prophecy about the fact that there would be earthquakes in various places were alive when a lot of these destructive earthquakes occurred. And the truth is that this has happened many times through the centuries, and the end has not come. So no, earthquakes are not a sign that the second coming of Jesus is imminent. Now don't get me wrong, Jesus is coming back one day, but these are not the indicators. In regard to Jesus' statement that there will be famines, yes, there have been terrible famines in modern times, but there were also terrible famines in the first century and every century since. So famines are not a sign that the second coming of Christ is imminent either. After telling his disciples then and now that nation will rise against nation and kingdom against kingdom, there will be earthquakes in various places and famines. Having told them that in verse 8a and 8b, Jesus states then in verse 8c that these are the what? Beginning of earth pains. And based on what we've studied, apparently we have been in the beginning of birth pains for 2,000 years. What's 2,000 years to God? Beginning of birth pains. In Jesus' day and every century since. Be careful what you're hearing out there. You have to be careful with the biblical text. You always have to understand history in the context. The history of the time, the history following the time, as well as what's going on today. And everything begins to look different, right? It's looking different to you now. So again, the appearance of false Christs from the first century forward, wars and rumors of wars from the first century forward, nations rising against nations and kingdoms against kingdoms from the first century forward, earthquakes and famines from the first century forward. None of these are signs that the second coming is imminent, according to Jesus in Mark 13, 5 through 8. He says in these verses, in relation to all of these things, read it with me. Do not be alarmed. The end is still to come. These are the beginning of birth pains. Where in that does he say all of these things were signs? Nowhere. Be careful out there. Now, since false Christs, wars and rumors of wars, conflict between nations, earthquakes and famines, since all these things occur repeatedly throughout history, it wouldn't be surprising if they were occurring during the period just prior to the second coming. Jesus is just making it clear in today's text that they are not indicators in and of themselves that the second coming is imminent. Just a few years after Jesus ascended back to heaven, there was a great famine throughout the Roman world, which would, of course, have included Judea, where Jesus was talking to the disciples about what we're studying today. And the specific famine just mentioned was predicted by a Christian in the early church who had the gift of prophecy and whose name was Agabus, which you can read about in Acts 11:27 through 30. The famous Jewish historian Josephus wrote about this famine. It took place in 46 AD. And you may remember that the Apostle Paul and Barnabas were traveling around to the churches in Asia Minor and Greece and such, taking up a collection to bring famine relief to the Christians that lived in Judea, in Palestine, who would have been hit particularly hard by that famine. Please take note that this prophesied famine that was severe and so widespread was not declared to be any kind of sign that the second coming of Jesus was imminent. It was not declared by Agabus, who predicted it, or by anyone else. Anyway, let's get back to Jesus saying that all we've been discussing are the beginning of birth pains. By saying this, what Jesus seems to be suggesting is that more and much worse things are going to be taking place when the end of the world as we know it is at hand and the second coming imminent. Much worse things than the stuff we've been talking about. Now, this is all going to be bad news for those who have rejected God and His Son. But for those who have accepted Jesus and belong to God, a new social order will be about to emerge. And it is going to be glorious for us. Right? For us. Okay. Are you rattled? Do you feel better? Is your head in conflict over what you've heard out there and what you just saw today? I showed you the text, right? We unpacked it in detail. Now, as I said last week, whenever it comes to end times, end of days stuff, everyone is guessing. There are those who are making an educated guess as to what all this stuff means. There are those who are making an uneducated guess. And there are those, dagnabbit, who are just making stuff up. They're just making it up as they go. I hear it and go like, what? Where did you get that from? Right? So I can't say that I'm infallible. I can't say that I couldn't be wrong, because I guess I could be, but I don't think so. Okay, that's all the time.